All right. So the topic for this week, the topic 5, is on factoring trinomials of this form. Last week, remember the coefficient a? That was 1. Remember that? That was what you worked on last week. This week, this coefficient of x squared is no longer 1. It'll be 2, 3. Sometimes it'll even be negative. And so there are a couple of problems you're going to see this week, and even in my math lab, where that coefficient of x squared is negative. And so that confuses students when they see that. The way you're going to work it uh, uh, for the most part this week is about trial and error. And sometimes it's called reverse FOIL. So we're going to talk about trial and error and reverse FOIL. Now here are the steps. So the first thing you're going to do is make sure the polynomial is in descending order. Make sure the trinomial is in descending order. So as we go through this, there'll be a couple where it's not in descending order. The second thing you're going to do is you're going to factor out the GCF if possible, and then you're going to factor the trinomial if possible. You always going to make sure, and number 4, you always going to make sure that your final answer, if you have a GCF that you factored out, that you have the GCF times those two factors. The ones that we're going to have in these lessons, if it's factorable, it'll be as two factors, some binomial times some binomial. Or if the GCF is 1, then it'll just be a binomial times a binomial. Always remember when you're factoring, your answer is always going to be a product, will be a product of factors. So you see where we have this times this. It'll be a product of factors, and all of these factors, as we go through this, all of these factors must be prime, must be prime. And so when all these factors are prime, it means you factored completely. So every time you factor, you must factor completely. Okay? All right. So what I want to do is look at a uh, at a few problems. So this is going to be number 1. So the directions will say something like this. The directions will say factor. All right, factor. Sometimes it may say factor completely. So you may see that instead. And I may be misspelling the word completely. But it'll say factor or factor completely. All right, just make sure that if you see factor, it means the same thing as factor completely. If you see factor complete, it means the same thing as factor. All right, so let's look at number 1. So number 1, let's suppose we had this problem. We had, let's say, 3p squared minus 2p minus 5. And I want to factor this trinomial. Remember, the first thing we have to make sure, if you recall, is make sure the polynomial is in descending order. So descending order means if you look at your variable, you have the largest exponent listed first. So I have p squared first, then p to the first, and my constant is last. So it is in descending order. Then the next thing you need to do is factor out the GCF if possible. So if you notice these 3 terms, the GCF is 1. GCF is 1. So there's nothing to factor out. So since there's nothing to factor out, then what we're going to do next is we're going to factor this trinomial so that way it looks like this. So in other words, I'm going to go directly from here. Since the GCF is 1, I'm going to go and do this now. Okay? And that's where we're going to use trial and error. Trial and error. Sometimes it's called reverse FOIL. So when you think of FOIL, remember first, outer, inner, last. So what you do first is look at F for first. So you see this right here is 3p squared. So you think about this. Now this one's gonna be easy because 3 is a prime number and 5 is a prime number. So that's gonna be easy. So when you think of F, you're thinking of what 2 things multiplied together is 3p squared. And there's only one possibility, 3p times p. Remember FOIL, first times first? So 3p times p is 3p squared. So far, this looks good. So I'm going to check it off for right now. It may be wrong, but I'm going to check it off. Then you go to the last. You go to the last. So now you're asking yourself, what times what is a negative 5? You see that's negative right here, right? So if the last sign's negative, if the last sign's negative, that means these signs in here are different, because they have to be different. A positive times a negative is a negative, right? Or a negative times a positive is a negative. So they have to be different. And I'm going to, for right now, all I'm going to do is put a plus symbol here and a subtraction symbol here. Now let's talk about the 5. There's only one possibility for 5. There's only one possibility for 5. 5 and 1. A positive 1 times a negative 5 is a negative 5. So if you look at what I have, remember this is trial and error. The more you do with this, the better you get. And most of you could have gotten the answer right away. But I'm just kind of telling you what some of your thought processes are going to be. So some of you can go from here to the answer right away, and that's great. But this is what you go through. Now, what gets students into trouble is this. They say, oh, I have 3p times p is 3p squared, and a positive 1 times a negative 5 is a negative 5, so I'm done. No, you're not. You haven't done anything with the outer and the inner. The outer and the inner has to give you this, the negative 2p. So here's what you do. You check the outer. Well, the outer, 3p times negative 5 is a negative 15p. The inner, 1 times p is p. And when I add them up, that's a negative 14p, and that's not what I wanted. So that means this is not correct. So hence the idea of trial and error. So you try something else. So you keep doing this. And again, the more you do, the easier it becomes. So then you try something else. You say, all right, I'm going to leave 3p and p as they are, and I'm going to put 5 here, 1 here instead. Say I had 1 with the 3p, 5 with the p. I'm going to switch them. And then I'm going to say, well, I'm going to make this negative and this positive instead. All right, let's check it. Okay, so you see I changed it, right? 3p plus 1 times p minus 5 is not the same as this. So we got to go through this process. So let's check FOIL again. Trial and error. 3p times p is 3p squared. I'm good so far. Now the last. So this is good. Now let's do the last. A negative 5 times a positive 1 is a negative 5. So far I'm good. Now let's do the outer and inner. The outer, 3p times 1 is 3p. The inner, negative 5 times p is a negative 5p. But when I add them up, negative 5p and 3p is a negative 2p. And that's what I wanted. So there's your answer. Okay, so you're going to say the answer is going to be 3p minus 5 times p plus 1. Okay, so that'll be your answer. So you wrote this as a product of primes. Now look, so what I mean when I say this, make sure that all factors are prime. That means this. So if I look at this factor right here, if I look at those two terms, the GCF is 1. There's nothing I can factor out. If I look at this, there's nothing I can factor out. Those two terms have nothing in common besides the number 1. No factor in common besides the number 1. So that's what I mean by make sure that all factors must be prime. So factor completely. All right, let's look at another one. So this is number 2. So in number 2, let's suppose we had this. In number 2, we had 2n squared plus 3n minus 9. So again, the GCF is, if you look at those three terms, the GCF is 1. And so since the GCF is 1, I'm going to go directly to the two binomials. One thing I also want to mention is if you exhaust all possibilities and nothing works, then say prime. You use the word prime. So the polynomial is prime, you cannot factor. So you saw something like that on last week's worksheets. Okay, so we go through the process. So reverse FOIL, trial and error. So you have f, so first times first. Now see, 2 is prime, but 3 is not, 9 is not. So 2 is going to be the easy one for us. So we have 2n times n is 2n squared. And then we do the last now. Again, we have a negative for the last, so that means these signs in here have to be different. So they're going to be different. So one's going to be positive, one's going to be negative. And just for right now, put a positive here, negative there. If that doesn't work, you switch the signs. Hence the idea of trial and error. Now for 9, there are two possibilities. I want you to think about this. There's 9 times 1, 3 times 3. What I would do first is I would do the 3 times 3 first. So I'm going to put the 3 here and the 3 here, see if that works. If 3 times 3 doesn't work in here, then we'll do the 9 and 1. But let's try 3 and 3. All right, so remember, I fill this in. Don't say that's your answer without checking it. Remember, we haven't done the out and the inner. Always double check the out and the inner. So let's do the F again. 2n times n is 2n squared. A positive 3 times a negative 3 is a negative 9. Let's go to the out and the inner. The outer is a negative 6n. The inner is a positive 3n. When I add these up, these are like terms. A positive 3n and a negative 6n is a negative 3n. But that's not what I wanted. But I want you to notice something. What I wanted is the opposite of what I have right now. So all that means is change the signs. That's all that means. So the answer then will be 2n minus 3, change the signs, times n plus 3. And that will be the answer. Now I also want to remind you, remember multiplication is commutative. So you see how I have the factor 2n minus 3 listed first? You could have also said this first, n plus 3 times 2n minus 3. All right, so trial and error. All right, let's look at number 3. Okay, number 3, let's suppose we had this, number 3. So this number 3, we have 4 minus 8n plus 3n squared. 4 minus 8n plus 3n squared. Okay, so remember, first thing you have to do is remember to put this in descending order. So this is not in descending order, it's ascending order. So I'm going to put the n squared first, then this, and then the constant last. So this becomes 3n squared minus 8n plus 4. So remember, descending order. Descending order. All right, now the GCF of those three terms is 1. So that means I'm going to go directly to the two binomials. All right, so let's go ahead and use that reverse foil, and see what we get. So for 3n squared, see 3 is prime, so that's easy. So it'll be 3n times n. 4, see that last sign's positive. In the previous two problems, remember the last sign was negative. Right here and right here. And so that means that these signs in here are different. That's the only way you can get a negative product. One's positive, one's negative. Here, though, the last sign's positive. That's the easy kind when the last sign's positive. When the last sign's positive, that means these signs in here are the same. Either they're both negative, because a negative times a negative is a positive, or they're both positives, because a positive times a positive is also a positive. But you know which one to use. It's always going to be that middle sign here. So if that's positive, that means these signs in here are the same, and it's going to be this sign right here. So I know that if this is factorable, then these two have to be negative symbols. All right, now we just got to figure out which one, what needs to go here if this is factorable. So for 4, there's two possibilities. 4 times 1, 2 times 2. Let's try the 2 times 2 first. So let's put 2 here, and see if that works. So we're going to do the FOIL. Always check. 3n times n, 3n squared. So for this is good. Now let's go to the L. Let's go to the last. A negative 2 times a negative 2 is a positive 4. That's good so far. Okay, now we got to check the outer and the inner. The outer, 3n times a negative 2 is a negative 6n. The inner, negative 2 times 2n times n is a negative 2n. And notice when I add them up, I get a negative 8n. So that's correct. So the answer will be 3n minus 2 times n minus 2. So that's the answer. All right, now let's go to number 4. Number 4, let's suppose we had this, 6x squared plus 10x minus 4. I want you to notice something here. The GCF is not 1 this time. See, all of these coefficients are divisible by 2, so I can factor out the 2. So the GCF is 2. Okay, so remember our steps. our steps. Factor out the GCF if possible. So if you factor out the GCF, it needs to look like this. The GCF times two binomials. So we're going to factor out the 2. In last week's worksheet, you had a problem where you did factor out. So factor out the 2. So you're going to say 2 times, and then remember the idea of the distributive property. 2 times 3x squared is 6x squared. 2 times a positive 5x is 10x. And then 2 times a negative 2 is a negative 4. Now what you're going to do is you're going to factor this right here. So you're going to, now always make sure you bring down the GCF. So you can say 2 times 2 factors whose product is this. Okay? And remember, sometimes, just like last week, this is not factorable, so that will be your answer. If you can factor out the GCF, that will be the answer. But for us, this will be factorable. So let's figure out what this is. So I'm going to go ahead and write it here, 3x squared plus 5x minus 2. All right, so we're going to do the two binomials. All right, and reverse FOIL. All right, so let's see what's going to work. So this is prime, so that's going to be easy for us. So 3x times x is 3x squared. So f is okay. Now let's go to the L. That's a 2. So the only possibility for 2 is 2 times 1. 2 times 1, that's the only possibility. So either you're going to put the 2 here or the 1 here. It does not matter for right now because you're going to check it. So let's go ahead and put the 2 here, the 1 here, and see what happens. The last sign's negative, right? So remember what that means. That means that in order for 2 times 1 to be negative, one of these has to be positive, the other has to be negative. Now, before you say this is a factorization for this, you need to check the outer and the inner. So let's do the F again. 3x times x is 3x squared. Now let's do the last. Positive 2 times negative 1 is a negative 2. Now let's do the outer and the inner. The outer is negative 3x. The inner is 2x. When I add this, I get a negative x, and that's not what I wanted. So then what that could mean is, well, let's switch the 2 and the 1. Let's see what happens. So this didn't work, right? So let's go back and redo this now. So we're going to switch them. So 3x, instead of putting 2 here, let's put 1 here. And x, and then instead of putting 1 here, let's put 2. Remember the last sign's negative. So these signs have to be different. So let's make this negative, this positive, see what happens. All right, so let's check it again. FOIL, we're going to check. So the first, 3x times x, is 3x squared, which is what I wanted, so that's good. The last, a negative 1 times a positive 2, is a negative 2, so that's good. Now let's do the outer and the inner. The outer, 3x times 2, is 6x. The inner, negative 1 times x is negative x, and notice when I add them up, a negative 1x and a positive 6x is a positive 5x, and that's what you wanted. So this goes here now. So it'll be 3x minus 2 times 3x minus 1 times x plus 2. All right? So notice that's your answer, though. Don't forget that GCF is part of the answer. If all you have is this, if all you have is this is the answer, then if you FOIL it out, you don't get this back. When you FOIL this out, you get this. But that's not what you wanted to factor. You wanted to factor this. So don't forget about your GCF. That goes in front. Now I want to say this. Some of you may forget about the GCF. And that's fine. So let's do the same problem and not worry about the GCF. I want to show you something. So 6x squared plus 10x minus 4. So some of you are going to go directly to the two binomials. All right, now just to remind you, if you have a GCF other than 1, it makes things a lot easier for you if you factor it out, because then these numbers here become much smaller to deal with. So just remember, if you have a GCF, it's always best idea to factor it out first. So let's suppose you forgot the GCF. So let's look at 6x squared. There's 3x and 2x, right? 3x times 2x is 6x squared. So if I do reverse FOIL, so the F is okay. Now the L, that's a 4. So 2 times 2 is 4. Let's use that and see if that works. Okay. Now the last sign's negative. That means these signs in here are different, right? So let's go ahead and make and make this negative, this positive, see what happens. So we got to do the outer and the inner. So the outer is 3x times 2 is 6x. The inner, negative 2 times 2x is negative 4x. When I add them up, I get 2x. So that didn't work. That didn't work at all. Okay? So 2 and 2 didn't work. So maybe if I use 4 times 1 instead. So in other words, I'm going to come here and instead of putting 2 times 2, let's put 4 times 1 instead. And let's do the same thing. This will be negative, this will be positive, and now let's check it. So FOIL. 3x times 2x is 6x squared. A negative 1 times a positive 4 is a negative 4. So far I have the first and last being good. Let's do the outer and the inner. The outer, 3x times 4 is 12x. The inner, negative 1 times 2x is negative 2x. And when I add them up, look, I get 10x, which is what I wanted. All right, so here's the problem though. Some of you are going to say this is your answer. You're going to say 3x minus 1 times 2x plus 4. That is not the answer. The reason it's not the answer, just like on worksheet number 1, the reason it's not the answer is because you got to make sure that these factors are prime. I want you to notice something. When you look at 2x plus 4, you could factor out a 2. So this becomes 2 times x plus 2. So you got to make sure that you look at your factors and you look to see if the GCF is other than 1. So now this becomes this. So let's put this in front. So this becomes 2 times 3x minus 1 times 2x plus 2. And that's the same answer we got here. See, those two are the same. So if you forget about the GCF, you can still factor. It's just that at the end, you have to look at your factors to see if you could factor out anything, and you will have to. All right, so just be careful about it. It makes things a lot easier for you if you do the GCF first. All right, so that was number 4. Now let's go to number 5. In number 5, let's suppose we have this in number 5. All right, number 5, we have 5x cubed minus 18x squared plus 9x. All right, so it's in descending order. Now, in this case, remember in problem number 4, if you forgot to do the GCF, if you forgot to factor out the GCF, you could still get the answer. It's very easy to get the answer. The problem here is that when there are variables in all of them, you really need to do the GCF. Because notice, it makes so much things easier for you if that last term doesn't have a variable in it. This last term has a variable in it. But notice that all these terms have x. So this is x cubed, this is x squared, this is x to the first. And remember, the GCF, when you're dealing with variables, is always the one with the smallest exponent. So the GCF here is x. So now you're going to factor out the x, and you get x times 5x squared is 5x cubed. X times a negative 18x. X times x is x squared, so that's negative 18x. X times a positive 9 is a positive 9x. And now we're going to factor this as two binomials. We're going to say x times the two binomials. All right, so now notice the last sign's positive, so that means these signs in here are the same. It'll be negative, so don't forget about that. All right, so let's do trial and error, reverse FOIL. So I want 5x squared. So there's only one possibility for 5x squared, and that's 5x and x. So let's put 5x here, x here. I know that these signs in here have to both be the same because a negative times a negative is a positive, and they have to be that middle sign. And for 9, there are two possibilities, 9 times 1, 3 times 3. Let's try 3 and 3 first and see if that works. So let's put 3 here, 3 here. All right, now you got to check this. So we haven't done the outer and inner yet, so you got to check that. So let's do the f and the L to make sure we're good with that. So 5x times x is 5x squared. So my first is okay. My last, negative 3 times a negative 3 is a positive 9. That's good. Now let's do the outer and the inner. The outer, 5x times a negative 3 is a negative 15x. The inner, negative 3 times x is a negative 3x. And a negative 3x and a negative 15x is a negative 18x, which is your middle term. So there's your answer. So the answer, you're going to say x times 5x minus 3 times x minus 3. And notice that when you look at all these binomials, those are prime. The GCF of these two terms, when you look at those two terms, the GCF here is 1, and the GCF here is 1. When you did this one, just to remind you, when you did this right here, the GCF of this last factor was a 2, so you have to take it out. All right, so that was number 5. Now let's get to number 6. Okay, number 6, let's suppose we had this. We had 8n cubed minus 30. I'm hoping I wrote this correct. 34n squared plus 8n. I'm thinking that's a 34. I could have messed that up. All right, so the GCF, see there's a variable in all terms, right? Just like we did here. But also notice this is 8, this is 34, and this is 8. So the GCF of 8, 34, and 8 is 2. So the GCF of this trinomial is going to be 2n this time. So I'm going to factor out the 2n. So when I factor out the 2n, I get 2n times 4n squared is 8n cubed. 2 times 4 is 8. N times n squared is n cubed. Minus 2 times 17n. 2n times 17n is 34n squared. And then plus 2n times 4 is 8n. All right, so now we're going to try and factor this trinomial as two binomials. So let's go off to the side and kind of figure that out. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite it here. 4n squared minus 17n plus 4. So we do the two binomials, and we remember reverse FOIL. Reverse FOIL. So for 4n, let's try 2n times 2n. Let's see if that's going to work. So 2n. So 2n times 2n is 4n squared. So my f is okay. For 4 here, for the last, let's do 2n. Oh, one other thing. All right, so you see I have 4, and we're going to put 2 and 2. I want to show you something. So you see the GCF here is 1, right? For this right here. So if you put a 2 here, see how this is a 2n and this is a 2? They have a 2 in common. That means you can factor out the 2. If you can factor out a 2 here, then that means that you can factor out a 2 here, and that's not possible. So that means that putting 2 and 2 here is not going to work. So let's try this then. Let's use 4 and 1. So I want to show you something. So that didn't work. So if I put the 2 in here and the n and 2 in here, 2n, let me do it over. So 2n, and if we try 4 and 1, regardless, I want to remind you, regardless of where you put the 4 and the 1, regardless of where you put it, if you put the 4 here, the 1 here, or the 1 here, the 4 here, you still have that issue though. What is the GCF here? The GCF is 1. Notice that this is 2, this is 4, so that means if whatever sign you put here, you could factor out the 2. If you can factor out the 2 here, that means that you can factor out the 2 here, and you cannot. So that means that this did not work. So hence trial and error. You got to go through that trial and error stuff. So what that means is this then, probably. What that means is, I'm going to rewrite it over. Instead of saying 2n times 2n, let's do 4n times n instead. And for 4, see, if I do 2 and 2, I'm going to have that issue. So for 4, I'm going to use 4 and 1. So I'm going to put this as 1, this as 4. Now let's see what happens. The last sign's positive. So that means that these signs in here have to be the same and they're both negative. Okay, now before I go on, remember what we're talking about. The GCF is 1. When I put these numbers in here, I noticed that I could factor out the 2 here. I could even factor out a 2 here, which means that I could factor out the 2 from here, and I can't because the GCF is 1. Even if I switch the instead of putting 2 times 2, I put 4 times 1. Regardless of where I put the 4, I could still factor out the 2, and that's not possible. So then I tried something else. So then I said, well, instead of doing 2n times 2n, let's do 4n times n. And instead of doing 2 times 2, let's do 4 times 1. So the 1 has to go here, the 4 has to go here. Because, and this is very useful, because if you put the 4 here, the 1 there, you could factor out the 4 from here, which means this is divisible by 4, and it's not, because 4 is not a factor of 17. So you know that 1 has to go here, 4 has to go here, and all you do for right now is check. 4n times n is 4n squared. A negative 1 times a negative 4 is a positive 4, and let's do the outer and the inner. The outer, 4n times a negative 4 is a negative 16n. The inner, negative 1 times n is a negative 1n. Notice when I add them up, I get a negative 17n, and that's what I wanted. So that is going to go here, right here. So I'm going to get 4n minus 1 times n minus 4. So notice the process you went through, the idea of trial and error. Okay? If something doesn't work, you try something else. And it's important to understand this part here, that if this GCF is 1, if that GCF is 1 right here, and you try some numbers and you notice I could factor out the 2, then you know that that cannot work because the GCF is 1. So then you try something else. All right? And notice here the GCF in each of these is 1, so it's factored completely. All right, so that's number 6. Number six was a little bit more difficult, but that discussion right here is important as you go through the next week or so. That's going to be important to think about. All right, number 7. Let's look at number 7. So number 7, let's suppose we had this in number 7. All right, let's suppose we had, now I'm going to write it out. I'm going to say this. I'm going to put negative 12x squared minus 10x plus 12. Now, see, this is negative right here, right? It's in descending order. The coefficient of x squared is negative. The directions will say something like this: factor out a negative GCF. Okay, so factor out a negative GCF. So notice the GCF of these 3 terms is going to be a negative 2. So the GCF is a negative 2. So whenever that number, the coefficient of x squared is negative, factor out a negative GCF. It makes things a lot easier for you. So then I'm going to get negative 2 times a negative 2 times a positive 6x squared is a negative 12x squared. A negative 2 times a positive 5x, a negative times a positive is a negative, so always be careful. A negative 2 times a positive 5x is a negative 10x, and a negative 2 times a negative 6 is a positive 12. And now I'm going to factor this as 2 binomials. So I'm going to get negative 2 times these 2 binomials. So let's go off to the side. I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this over. So 6x squared plus 5x minus 6, and see what we can do there. So we remember reverse FOIL, trial and error. So this is a 6 right here. So let's try 3 and 2. So 3x and 2x, okay? So 3x times 2x is 6x squared. The last sign's negative, so remember the last sign's negative. That means these signs in here are different. And for 6, let's do 3 and 2 again. Now I want to remind you something. Okay, so we're trying 3 and 2, right? Is it a good idea to put a 3 here and a 2 here? And I'm hoping that if you're thinking about it, you say no. Because what is the GCF of this trinomial? The GCF of this trinomial is, the GCF is 1. So when you look at this factor right here, that you see you could take out a 3, right? and you can take out a 2 here. So this is 3 times 2, which is 6, which means if this were true, then the GCF would be 6. And the GCF is not 6 because this is not divisible by 6. So that means don't put the 3 here and don't put the 2 here. This is what you would do. Watch. Very simple. Instead of putting the 3 with the 3x, put the 2 with the 3x. Instead of putting the 2 with the 2x, put the 3 with the 2x. Because notice the GCF here is 1, the GCF here is 1, and that GCF is 1. Now let's do the plus and the minus again. Now let's check it. Always check. Check the out and the inner. First of all, let's do the f again. 3x times 2x is 6x squared. A positive 2 times a negative 3 is a negative 6. Now let's do the out and the inner. The outer, 3x times negative 3 is a negative 9x. The inner, a positive 2 times 2x is 4x. When I add them up, I get a negative 5x. But that's not what I wanted. I wanted a positive 5x, but those are opposites. So all that means is you change the signs. So in other words, instead of this being the answer for this, it'll be this. It'll be 3x. Instead of saying plus 2, you're going to say minus 2. And instead of saying 2x minus 3, you're going to say 2x plus 3. And now if you check the out and the inner, watch. 3x times 3 is 9x. A negative 2 times 2x is a negative 4x. And when you add them up, you get 5x, which is what you wanted. So that is going to go here now. So I get negative 2 times 3x minus 2 times 2x plus 3. All right. Now let's look at number 8. I think I have time to do maybe 1 or 2 more. So let's look at number 8. So in number 8, and you will see this, so let's do one with 2 variables, just to remind you how to deal with this. You had one on last week's worksheet, but let's look at this one. So let's suppose in number 8, let's suppose we had this. Okay, let's do this one. So we have 12x squared minus 105xy plus 72y squared. So notice that you have 2 variables, an x squared and a y squared. But I also want you to notice is that, see this 12 right here, and this 105, actually it's a negative 105, and this positive 72, they're all divisible by 3. So the GCF is 3. So don't try factoring this. Don't go directly to this, because these are big numbers right here. All these are big numbers. So if you could factor out the 3, it'll make those numbers smaller, and it'll be easier to deal with. So take out the 3 first. It'll be 3 times, so 3 times 4x squared. See, now it's a lot smaller, right? Instead of having a 12, you have a 4 now. And then 3 times, and I think that's going to be, let me take a calc. I think that's going to be 35xy. 3 times 35 is negative 105. And then 3 times, and I think that's going to be 24. So plus 24y squared. So now we're going to factor this. So we're going to go 3 times 2 binomials. All right. Now, there are 2 possibilities for 4. There's 2 times 2 and 4 times 1. Let's just try 4 times 1 this time. So let's put 4x and x. And for 24, there are several. So that's where that trial and error comes in. So try something. If it doesn't work, you try something else. So for 24, I want you to think about this. For 24y squared, you have 6y times 4y. You have 2y times 12y. 2 times 12 is 24. You have, let's see, what else? 8y times 3y. And you also have 24y times y. So those are all a lot of possibilities. So for right now, let's do the 6 and the 4 and see if that works. Okay, 6 and 4, okay? Now look, you see I put a 4x here, right? Put a 4x here. So if you put 6y here, you know that cannot work. You know that cannot work because look at 4 and 6. Regardless of what sign you put here, and they both have to be negative, right? Because that's positive. So do you agree I could factor out the 2 from here, which means that this right here, if I rewrite it, and if you think about it, the GCF of this is 1. So if the GCF of this is 1, then that means that I cannot have this situation. I cannot put the 6y here. So you may say, well, what, you're going to put the 4y here instead? If you do, you get the same thing, don't you? This time you could factor out a 4. So that didn't work either. So what that means is through this trial and error, what that means is that 6y and 4y won't work. So then let's try something else. So let's go to the 8 and the 3. Let's do the 8 and the 3y. Let's see if that's going to work. So you see trial and error, and you get better as you work through these. So I'm going to do 4x and x. Now I'm going to ask you this. See that 8y? Is it a good idea to put 8y here? The answer is no. Remember, they're both negative. The answer is no, because that means you could factor out the 4 here, which means that the GCF would be not 1, it will be 4. So that means you're not going to put the 8y here. So that means what? You're going to put the 3y here? Well, probably. Let's check. So that didn't work, right? So let's do it again. So 4x, x, and we're going to put the 3y and the 8y here. The last sign is positive. That means these signs are here the same. We're going to be the middle sign. We're going to be negative. Now let's check the outer and the inner. The outer 4x times a negative 8y is a negative 32xy. Okay? Negative 3y times x is a negative 3xy. When I add them up, a negative 3 and a negative 32 is a negative 35xy, and look, that's what you wanted. So this is correct. So the answer is going to be 3 times 4x minus 3y times x minus 8y. All right, and that's basically what you're going to be doing this week. You're going to be going through all of these types of problems. Now, one more thing I want to do is something like number 9, because you may see this on your worksheet. So just real quick, I want to do one like number 9. So let's suppose we had this, negative 8x squared plus 22x minus 15. So it's in descending order, so that's a good thing. The problem, though, is that x squared, the coefficient is negative. Whenever the coefficient is negative for the x squared term, factor out a negative GCF. Notice the GCF of those 3 terms is a negative 1. So I'm going to go ahead and factor out a negative 1. So this becomes negative 1 times 8x squared is negative 8x squared. A negative 1 times a negative 22x is a positive 22x. A negative 1 times a positive 15 is a negative 15. So whenever the coefficient of x squared is negative, you got to factor out a negative. In this case, it was going to be a negative 1 for the GCF. Now let's go ahead and factor this. So we get negative 1 times. Okay, so let me go ahead and do this on the side. Ax squared minus 22x plus 15. So let's just do that one. All right, so I'm going to reverse FOIL. All right, for 8x, there's a couple possibilities. Let's do 4 and 2. So let's try 4x and 2x. All right, now see the last sign's positive. That's always a good thing when the last sign's, the last sign's positive. It's always a good sign when the last sign's positive because these signs here are the same and they're going to be this middle sign. Now that 15, let's do 5 and 3 instead of 15 and 1. And I'm going to put the 5 here, the 3 there. If that doesn't work, we'll switch them. Trial and error. That's all it says is trial and error. All right, now you got to check though. Don't say that's the answer without checking. You have plenty of time to check. Now you go to the FOIL method. First, 4x times 2x is 8x squared. We're good with that so far. The last, a negative 5 times a negative 3 is a positive 15. We're good. Now let's do the outer and the inner. The outer, 4x times a negative 3 is a negative 12x. a negative 5 times 2x is negative 10x. When I add them up, hey, I got it. It's negative 22x. So that is going to go here. So you're going to say negative 1 times 4x minus 5 times 2x minus 3. Now, I want to say this. You can leave your answer like this, and that's fine. Or you can just say this. Remember, if there is no coefficient right here, it's understood to be a 1. So this means the same thing as this. So just keep that in mind, that those mean the same thing. Okay? All right, guys. So that is basically what you're going to be doing this week for most of this week. And it's just trial and error. If something doesn't work, you try something else. All right, but keep in mind, as you go through the process, you use this idea. Okay? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end this recording of the notes.